In this video, you will hear 5 horror stories that you will not be able to watch until the end. Anyone under the age of 18, please do not watch this video. Let's go! Story 1. The Lighthouse's Secret. Duncansby Head, Scotland. Part 1. The Arrival at Duncansby Head. The waves crashed below, the sound echoing across the barren cliffs of Duncansby Head. Ian McCormick zipped up his jacket, the wind cutting through him with a sharp, chilling bite. His eyes, however, were fixed on the old lighthouse that stood like a lonely sentinel at the edge of the cliffs. Once a beacon of hope for ships traversing the North Sea, it had long since been abandoned. The structure, weathered by decades of neglect, leaned slightly, giving it a spectral air, as if it too had been drawn into the mysteries surrounding its history. Ian felt a mixture of excitement and dread as he stood before it. This was the place where Malcolm Ross, the last keeper of the lighthouse, and his family had vanished without a trace in 1937. It was an unsolved mystery that had haunted Ian's thoughts for years. He had spent countless hours reading old news clippings, poring over the sparse records that existed, and now he was here, at the source, hoping to uncover something, anything, that could explain what had happened to the Ross family. His boots crunched on the gravel path as he approached the door, the wind howling around him. There was a heaviness in the air, an oppressive weight that pressed down on his shoulders the closer he got to the lighthouse. It was a sensation he couldn't quite explain, like a primal warning to turn back. But Ian wasn't one to heed such warnings. He had come too far, and the questions burning in his mind needed answers. The door to the lighthouse was stiff, but with a solid shove it creaked open, releasing a cloud of dust into the air. Ian stepped inside, his flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. The interior was just as he had imagined, abandoned, frozen in time. Dust-covered furniture, a rusted stove, and remnants of old equipment lay scattered about. Everything had been left as it was, as if the family had simply vanished in the middle of their daily routines. He made his way through the narrow hallway, his footsteps echoing eerily in the stillness. There was no sign of life, no photographs, no personal items, nothing that hinted at the family who had once lived here. It was as if the Ross family had been erased, their existence wiped from this place. Ian's heart pounded as he climbed the steep spiral staircase to the top of the tower. He had read about the lightkeeper's quarters, the small room at the top where Malcolm Ross had spent his final days, and the beacon that had gone dark after his disappearance. The staircase creaked under his weight, and he felt the chill intensify as he ascended. At the top, the air seemed different, heavier, colder. The light chamber was a cramped, circular space, dominated by the rusted remains of the lighthouse's beacon. Ian walked toward it, running his hand over the corroded metal. He tried to imagine Malcolm Ross standing here, night after night, keeping the light alive, guiding ships through the treacherous waters below. But something had gone wrong. Ian couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had happened here wasn't just a simple disappearance. He noticed a small desk pushed against the far wall, and his heart skipped a beat. On the desk lay an old weathered journal, its pages yellowed with age. He approached it cautiously, as though it were a relic from another world. The name on the cover, Malcolm Ross, confirmed it. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the journal. The first few entries were mundane. Reports about the weather, notes about the upkeep of the lighthouse, mentions of his wife and children. But as Ian flipped through the pages, the tone began to shift. The handwriting grew erratic, the entries shorter and more disjointed. The light. There's something wrong with the light. It doesn't feel right anymore. I've seen it in the waves. It's waiting. Ian's breath quickened as he read on. I tried to stop it, but it won't go dark. The light. It's calling to something out there. God help us, it's calling to something from the deep. I can hear them now, their voices in the wind. The final entry was scrawled hastily, as if written in a state of panic. They've come. The sea is alive with them. If anyone finds this, know that it wasn't the storm that took us. It was something else. Something from below. A shiver ran down Ian's spine. He had always believed the rumors were exaggerated, the result of overactive imaginations in a time of isolation and fear. But Malcolm's words were different. They had a weight to them, a desperation that was impossible to dismiss. Ian closed the journal and glanced out the window. The sea was calm, the waves lapping against the rocks far below. But now he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, waiting beneath the surface, something that had been summoned by the light. Part 2. The beacon ignites. Ian stood at the top of the lighthouse, staring at the old beacon. The journal in his hands felt heavier now, the words echoing in his mind. The light is calling them. What had Malcolm Ross meant? What had he seen out there in the waves? The wind howled through the cracks in the lighthouse, and for a moment, Ian considered leaving. Perhaps it was just his imagination running wild, spurred on by the eerie atmosphere of the abandoned lighthouse and the ominous words in the journal. But curiosity got the better of him. Ian stepped closer to the beacon, examining its rusted mechanisms. It was amazing that the light had ever worked, given the state of the equipment. He turned the crank experimentally, half expecting it to be stuck in place. But to his surprise, the gears moved. The ancient metal groaned in protest, but the machinery inside slowly began to turn. A low hum filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. Ian hesitated, his fingers hovering over the final switch that would ignite the light. Should he turn it on? The rational part of his mind told him it was a bad idea. There was no need to activate the lighthouse. It served no purpose now. And given Malcolm Ross's warnings, it might only stir up whatever dark forces had led to his disappearance. But another part of Ian, his historian's curiosity, the need to uncover the truth, pushed him forward. With a deep breath, he flipped the switch. The light flared to life with a blinding intensity, flooding the room with an eerie, pulsating glow. For a moment, Ian was mesmerized by the sight. The beam of light shot out across the darkening sea, cutting through the mist like a knife. But something was wrong. The light wasn't steady, it pulsed, like the rhythm of a heartbeat. The room seemed to throb in time with the light, and Ian felt a strange pressure building in his chest. He backed away from the beacon, the journal still clutched in his hand, his heart pounding in sync with the light. Outside, the sea roared as the wind intensified, whipping the waves into a frenzy. Ian glanced out the window, and his breath caught in his throat. There was something in the water. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, a reflection on the surface of the sea. But as the light pulsed again, the shape became clearer. A dark silhouette moved beneath the waves, its form massive and unnatural. Ian squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The shape grew larger, rising toward the surface. Ian's heart pounded in his chest as he realized with growing horror that it wasn't just one creature. There were several of them, moving in unison, their glowing eyes fixed on the lighthouse. "The light is calling them!" Malcolm's words echoed in Ian's mind as the creatures began to emerge from the water, their long, glowing tendrils reaching up toward the cliffs. The largest of them, a grotesque, fish-like creature with slick black skin and eyes that glowed like lanterns, rose above the waves, its massive form towering over the others. Ian stumbled back, his hand gripping the railing as he fought the urge to scream. The creature let out a low, guttural sound that reverberated through the air, shaking the lighthouse to its foundations. Its glowing eyes locked onto the beacon, and Ian realized with a sinking feeling that he had made a terrible mistake. He had activated the light, and now the creatures were coming. Panicking, Ian scrambled to turn the beacon off, but the machinery had locked into place. The light continued to pulse, drawing the creatures closer with each passing second. Desperate, Ian grabbed a nearby wrench and slammed it into the gears, hoping to break the mechanism. But it was too late. The light flared even brighter, casting an unearthly glow over the cliffs. The creatures let out a chorus of eerie, inhuman wails, their tendrils thrashing wildly as they scaled the rocks. Ian backed away from the beacon, his heart racing. He needed to get out of here. He needed to escape before the creatures reached the lighthouse. Without a second thought, Ian turned and bolted down the spiral staircase. The sound of his footsteps drowned out by the howling wind and the deafening roar of the creatures outside. The lighthouse creaked and groaned around him, as if it were being torn apart by the very forces he had unleashed. Part 3. Escape from the lighthouse. Ian's heart raced as he descended the spiral staircase, the walls of the lighthouse seeming to close in around him. His breath came in ragged gasps, and every step felt slower than the last. The oppressive atmosphere grew heavier with each turn of the stairs, as though the very air had become thick with the presence of something malevolent. He could hear the creatures outside, their guttural growls and the scrape of their bodies against the rocks as they climbed towards the lighthouse. The beacon above him continued to pulse, its light cutting through the night like a beacon of doom, calling to the horrors from the deep. Ian stumbled, nearly falling down the stairs as the ground beneath him seemed to tremble. The lighthouse was groaning, its ancient stones shifting under the strain of forces far beyond human comprehension. The whole structure felt alive, as if it too were reacting to the presence of the creatures. When he finally reached the bottom of the stairs, Ian threw open the door and stumbled out into the night. The wind tore at his clothes, and the salt spray from the sea stung his face. He looked toward the cliffs and saw them. Dozens of grotesque, glowing creatures crawling up the rocks, their tendrils waving in the air like searching fingers. His car was parked a few hundred feet away, a tiny speck of hope in the overwhelming darkness. Ian sprinted toward it, his feet pounding against the uneven ground, but when he reached it, he stopped short. The tires had been slashed, all 4 of them. Ian's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't seen anyone else since he arrived at Duncansby Head. Who could have done this? Or what? The answer didn't matter. What mattered was that his only means of escape was now useless. The creatures let out another series of wails, their cries echoing across the cliffs. Ian turned, his eyes scanning the landscape for another way out. But there was nothing. Just the lighthouse behind him, the jagged cliffs, and the sea below. He was trapped. Desperate, he ran back toward the lighthouse, hoping to find something, anything that could help him. As he reached the door, the ground beneath him trembled again, and he looked up just in time to see one of the creatures crest the top of the cliff. The thing was massive, its body glistening in the light from the beacon. Its long tendrils swayed hypnotically in the air, and its glowing eyes were fixed on the lighthouse, unblinking and malevolent. Ian froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't look away. For a moment, the world seemed to slow, and all Ian could hear was the sound of his own heartbeat, thudding in his ears. The creature let out a low growl, its tendrils twitching as it began to slither forward. Ian snapped out of his trance and bolted back into the lighthouse, slamming the door shut behind him. He leaned against it, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. But the reprieve was short-lived. The lighthouse shuddered violently, and Ian realized with a sickening certainty that the creatures were coming for him. He had to get higher. He had to get away from them. Ian raced back up the spiral staircase, his mind racing. Maybe if he could reach the beacon, he could figure out a way to stop it, to turn off the light and send the creatures back to the depths. But deep down, he knew it was a fool's hope. The light had a power of its own, a force that he didn't understand. As he climbed, the walls around him seemed to shift and warp, distorting like the surface of water. Ian blinked, trying to clear his vision, but the sensation only grew stronger. The lighthouse was changing, its very structure twisting in response to the presence of the creatures. His head spun, and for a moment, he wasn't sure if he was still inside the lighthouse or somewhere else entirely. The air was thick with the scent of salt and decay, and strange whispers echoed through the corridors, voices that seemed to come from the very stones themselves. When Ian reached the top of the stairs, he burst into the light chamber, gasping for air. The beacon continued to pulse, casting long shadows across the room. But something was different now. The journal, the one he had found earlier, was gone. In its place was a new book, its cover smooth and black, as though it had just been placed there. Ian approached it cautiously, his hands trembling. He didn't want to touch it, but something compelled him to. He reached out and opened the cover, revealing page after page of strange symbols, written in a language he didn't recognize. The moment his fingers touched the pages, a voice echoed in his mind, low, guttural, and full of malice. "You have called us. We have come." Ian stumbled back, his vision blurring as the voice filled his head. It wasn't just one voice, it was many, all speaking in unison, a cacophony of whispers that grew louder with each passing second. The room around him warped again, the walls twisting and bending as though they were made of liquid. Ian clutched his head, trying to block out the voices, but they only grew louder. "The light is ours. The deep is ours. You are ours." Part 4. The Descent into Madness. Ian's vision swam as the voices continued to assault his mind. He staggered back, clutching the edge of the desk for support as the lighthouse seemed to spin around him. The walls warped and twisted, the floor shifting beneath his feet. It was as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling, and Ian was caught in the middle of it. The journal lay open on the desk, the strange symbols glowing faintly in the light of the beacon. Ian tried to look away, but his eyes were drawn to the pages, as if they held some terrible secret he needed to uncover. The voices in his head grew louder, more insistent. They were speaking to him now, calling him by name. "Ian McCormick, you have come to us. You have awakened the light." Ian shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. This couldn't be real. It had to be a hallucination, a trick of the mind brought on by the stress of the situation. But the more he tried to convince himself, the less certain he became. The light from the beacon pulsed again, brighter this time, and Ian felt a surge of energy pass through him. It was as if the light was alive, connected to something far older and more powerful than he could comprehend. He stumbled toward the window, his legs shaking beneath him. Outside, the sea churned violently, the waves crashing against the rocks with a deafening roar. And there, rising from the depths, were more of the creatures, dozens of them, their glowing eyes fixed on the lighthouse. Ian's heart raced as he watched them crawl up the cliffs, their slimy bodies undulating in the moonlight. They were coming for him, drawn by the light that he had so foolishly ignited. "The light is the key," the voice in his mind whispered. "It calls to the deep, to those who have been forgotten." Ian backed away from the window, his pulse pounding in his ears. He couldn't stay here. He had to escape. But where could he go? The creatures were everywhere, their tendrils reaching out toward the lighthouse, their eyes glowing with a hunger that sent shivers down his spine. He turned and ran back toward the staircase. But as he reached the top step, the floor shifted beneath him, and he stumbled, falling to his knees. The air around him seemed to thicken, the walls closing in as the voices in his head grew louder. "There is no escape, Ian McCormick. You are one of us now." Ian gasped for air, his chest tight with fear. He could feel the presence of something ancient and malevolent pressing down on him, suffocating him with its weight. The light from the beacon pulsed again, and this time, Ian felt it deep within his soul. "You belong to the light," the voices whispered. "You belong to the deep." Ian scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. He couldn't let this happen. He had to fight it, had to find a way to stop the light before it consumed him. But how? His eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything that could help him. And then he saw it, a small rusted lever near the base of the beacon. It was covered in dust, almost hidden in the shadows, but Ian knew instinctively that it was important. He rushed toward it, his hands shaking as he grabbed the lever and pulled with all his strength. For a moment, nothing happened. And then, with a loud screech, the beacon's light flickered and dimmed. The voices in Ian's head screamed in protest, their wails echoing through his mind like the cries of the damned. But Ian gritted his teeth and held on, pulling the lever harder. The light dimmed further, flickering weakly as the machinery groaned in protest. Ian could feel the power of the beacon waning, the connection to the creatures weakening. But just as he thought he was winning, the ground beneath him shook violently, and the lever snapped off in his hands. The light flared back to life, brighter than before, and Ian was thrown backward, his body slamming into the wall. He lay there, dazed and gasping for breath, as the lighthouse shuddered and groaned around him. The creatures outside let out a triumphant roar, their eyes glowing brighter as they surged toward the tower. "It is too late," the voices whispered. "You cannot stop the light. You cannot stop us." Ian struggled to his feet, his vision swimming. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion and terror, the voices and the light consuming him from within. He stumbled toward the window, his hands gripping the frame as he looked out at the creatures below. They were almost at the top of the cliff now, their glowing tendrils reaching out toward the lighthouse, their eyes fixed on the beacon. Ian felt a wave of despair wash over him. There was no escape. The light had called them, and they had come. "You are one of us now, Ian McCormick," the voices whispered. "Embrace the deep. Embrace the light." Part 5. The Final Revelation. Ian stood at the edge of the window, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The creatures were almost here. He could hear them now. The scrape of their bodies against the rocks, the wet slap of their tendrils as they reached out toward the lighthouse. The air was thick with the scent of salt and decay, and the sound of the crashing waves seemed to echo in his skull. The light from the beacon pulsed again, brighter than ever, casting a sickly glow over the room. Ian could feel its pull, a force that tugged at his very soul. He knew now that there was no escape. The light was not just a beacon, it was a doorway, a bridge between worlds, and he had opened it. He could hear the creatures now, their voices blending with the whispers in his mind. "Come to us, Ian McCormick. Come to the deep." Ian's body moved on its own, his legs carrying him toward the light. He no longer had control. He was no longer Ian McCormick, historian and investigator. He was something else now, something ancient, something that belonged to the deep. The creatures reached the top of the cliff, their glowing eyes fixed on the lighthouse. Ian felt a surge of understanding wash over him. This was what Malcolm Ross had discovered all those years ago. The light was not a tool for man. It was a signal, a call to the creatures from the depths, the drowned ones. Ian stepped into the light, his body trembling as the tendrils of the creatures reached out to him. He didn't resist. He didn't fight. He was one of them now. He belonged to the light. He belonged to the deep, and the light would guide them all. The end. Story 2. The Carnival That Never Left. Location: Pine Barrens, New Jersey, USA. Part 1. The Legend of the Carnival. The Pine Barrens stretched out like an endless maze of trees and shadows, the underbrush thick with tangled vines and twisted roots. Sarah Delaney sat in the passenger seat of her brother Mark's truck, her fingers tracing the edge of the map they had found buried in one of the old archives back in the small town of Chatsworth. The map was tattered and faded, its edges yellowed with age, but there was no mistaking the crude, hand-drawn outline of the carnival grounds hidden deep within the forest. "This is the spot," Sarah said, pointing to a cluster of symbols on the map. "The Carnival of Shadows. It's supposed to appear somewhere around here." Mark raised an eyebrow but kept his eyes on the dirt road ahead. "You sure about this? I mean, it's just a legend, right? A ghost story." Sarah smiled. "You didn't believe in the Jersey Devil either, remember? And we both know how that turned out." Mark sighed, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. He didn't need to be reminded of their last urban exploration, where they had narrowly escaped a cave that locals said was haunted by the infamous cryptid. Ever since then, Sarah had been chasing leads on the weird and unexplained, and this latest adventure was no exception. The Carnival of Shadows was different, though. According to local legend, It was a carnival that had appeared suddenly in the 1940s, seemingly out of nowhere. The townspeople had flocked to it, lured by promises of incredible performances and strange wonders. But those who entered the carnival were never the same when they returned, if they returned at all. Some said the carnival disappeared just as quickly as it had come, vanishing into thin air, only to reappear decades later in a different part of the Pine Barrens. Others claimed the carnival never really left. It was just hiding, waiting for its next round of unsuspecting visitors. Sarah and Mark had stumbled upon the story while digging through old records in the local library. There had been vague references to missing persons, strange lights, and unexplained sightings throughout the years, all pointing to the same strange carnival. And now, here they were, deep in the heart of the Barrens, chasing the latest rumors of its reappearance. Mark brought the truck to a stop at the end of a narrow dirt path. Ahead of them, the forest loomed thick and dark, the trees swaying slightly in the evening breeze. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and decaying leaves. "This is as far as we can go by car," he said, cutting the engine. "If the carnival's out there, we'll have to go on foot from here." Sarah nodded, already climbing out of the truck. The excitement that had been bubbling inside her for days was finally reaching a peak. She grabbed her backpack and slung it over her shoulders, checking that her camera and flashlight were secure. Together, they set off into the woods, following the faint trail that led deeper into the Barrens. The further they walked, the darker it became, the trees crowding closer as the last light of day faded. Sarah kept her eyes peeled for any sign of the carnival, any flicker of light, any distant sound of music. But the forest remained silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves underfoot. After what felt like hours, they emerged into a small clearing. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. There, standing in the center of the clearing, was the skeleton of a large tent, its faded red and white stripes barely visible under layers of dirt and grime. The frame was rusted and bent, but it was unmistakably a circus tent. Surrounding it were the remnants of other carnival structures: a Ferris wheel, its metal frame groaning in the wind, a dilapidated carousel, its horses frozen in mid-gallop, and a row of crumbling booths, their signs too weathered to read. "We found it," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Mark stared, wide-eyed. "No way." They moved closer, their steps cautious. The place looked abandoned, as if it had been left to rot for decades. But there was something off about it, something that made the hair on the back of Sarah's neck stand on end. The air felt different here, thicker, heavier. And though there was no sign of life, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Part 2. The carnival comes to life. As Sarah and Mark ventured further into the decaying carnival, the silence became oppressive. It was as though the forest had been muted, the sounds of nature swallowed by the presence of the dilapidated structures around them. The Ferris wheel creaked as it swayed in the breeze, and the metal groaned, echoing through the empty grounds. Mark pointed toward the large tent at the center. "Let's check out the main tent. That's where most of the performances were held, right?" Sarah nodded, her gaze lingering on the half-collapsed house of mirrors. It was eerie, the way the shattered glass still caught the faint light filtering through the trees, casting distorted reflections of the carnival grounds. She felt a pull to explore it, but something in her gut told her to stay with Mark. They approached the main tent cautiously, its once grand entrance now torn and sagging. The tattered fabric flapped weakly in the breeze, and as they stepped inside, a musty, rotting smell hit them. The tent was large, larger than it had appeared from the outside, and the rows of wooden benches still stood in place, though many were broken and covered in dirt. At the far end of the tent was a stage, its curtains faded but still intact. As they moved deeper into the tent, Mark froze. "Do you hear that?" Sarah stopped and strained her ears. At first, all she could hear was the creaking of the old structure and the occasional rustle of leaves from outside. But then, faintly, she heard it. A soft, melodic tune, like distant carnival music. "I thought this place was abandoned," Mark muttered. Sarah's heart raced. Maybe it's an old speaker system or something. It could be on a loop. But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. The music wasn't mechanical. It was too fluid, too alive, and it was growing louder. Without warning, the lights above them flickered to life. Strings of carnival lights, which had been dead and covered in cobwebs, now shone brightly, casting the tent in a warm, golden glow. "What the hell?" Mark stepped back, his eyes wide. Sarah looked around in shock. The tent was no longer in ruins. The benches were whole, the dirt and decay gone, replaced by a lively, vibrant atmosphere. The carnival music was now loud and clear, and the sound of voices, laughter, chatter, the hum of excitement filled the air. "It's like it's alive," Sarah whispered. Before either of them could process what was happening, a figure appeared on the stage. He was tall and impossibly thin, dressed in a flamboyant harlequin outfit. His face was hidden behind a mask that seemed to shift in color and shape, changing with every movement. His long, spindly arms moved with exaggerated grace as he waved to the invisible crowd. "Welcome, welcome," the figure called, his voice echoing through the tent. "Welcome to the Carnival of Shadows. We've been waiting for you." Sarah and Mark exchanged panicked glances. "This can't be real," Mark muttered, taking a step back toward the entrance. But Sarah couldn't move. She was transfixed by the figure on stage, by the way his mask seemed to watch her no matter where she stood. The harlequin tilted his head, as if sensing her fear. "Oh, don't be frightened, my dear. You've come for the show, haven't you? You've come for the wonders, the thrills, the delights." Sarah's mouth went dry. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs felt rooted to the spot. Mark grabbed her arm. "We need to get out of here now." But before they could make it to the exit, the entrance to the tent flapped open, and another figure stepped inside. She was tall and elegant, draped in a long, flowing gown. Her face was partially obscured by a veil, but her hands, her long, talon-like fingers, were visible as she moved closer. "Madame Claw," the harlequin announced with a flourish, "our resident fortune-teller. Perhaps you'd like to know your fate?" Mark tightened his grip on Sarah's arm. "We're leaving." But Madame Claw's voice was soft, almost soothing as she spoke. "No one leaves the Carnival of Shadows once they've arrived." Her fingers moved with a hypnotic grace, and Sarah felt a strange pull in the pit of her stomach. She shook her head, trying to break free from whatever trance was trying to take hold of her. Mark tugged her toward the exit, and they stumbled out of the tent, the warm lights of the carnival suddenly dimming behind them. But as they ran through the carnival grounds, the once dilapidated rides and booths now glowed with life, the lights flickering on, and the sounds of the carnival filling the air. The Ferris wheel turned slowly, the creak of its old metal drowned out by the laughter of invisible riders. The carousel spun in lazy circles, the painted horses seeming to move of their own accord, and everywhere they looked, shadows danced, figures moving just beyond their sight, always in the corners of their vision. "We need to get out of here," Mark panted, pulling Sarah toward the forest. But no matter how far they ran, the carnival stretched on, its boundaries seemingly endless. The trees, the path, the truck, they were gone. All that remained was the carnival and its strange, shifting lights. Part 3. Lost in the carnival's maze. "Where are we?" Sarah gasped, her chest burning as they stopped to catch their breath. Around them, the carnival sprawled out in every direction, an impossible maze of twisted attractions, flickering lights, and distorted music. Mark shook his head, panic evident in his eyes. "We should have hit the forest by now. This isn't right. It's like we're trapped." Sarah glanced around, trying to get her bearings. The carnival was shifting, the rides and tents moving as if they had a life of their own. One moment, The Ferris wheel was on their left, the next, it was behind them. The tents flickered in and out of view, never staying in one place for more than a few seconds. "We're going in circles," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "We can't escape." Mark gritted his teeth. "We will. We just need to keep moving." But as they turned to run again, a voice called out from behind them. "Leaving so soon!" Sarah spun around to see the Harlequin standing just a few feet away, his mask shifting through a kaleidoscope of colors. He was impossibly tall, his spindly limbs bending in unnatural ways as he took a step toward them. "You can't leave," he said, his voice a sing-song melody. "The carnival doesn't let anyone leave." Mark stepped in front of Sarah, his hands clenched into fists. "Stay away from us." The Harlequin chuckled, a sound that sent shivers down Sarah's spine. "Oh, but why would you want to leave? The fun is just beginning." As he spoke, more figures emerged from the shadows, performers, dressed in grotesque costumes, their faces painted in exaggerated expressions of joy and sorrow. A fire breather with charred skin, a clown with too wide a grin, a contortionist who twisted her body into impossible shapes. They circled around Sarah and Mark, their eyes gleaming with amusement. Sarah's heart raced. There were too many of them. They were surrounded. The Harlequin clapped his hands, and the performers stilled, their eyes never leaving Sarah and Mark. "You're our guests of honor tonight, and the show must go on." Mark grabbed Sarah's arm. "Run." But as they turned to flee, the ground beneath them shifted. What had been dirt and grass was now a smooth, reflective surface. Sarah gasped as she realized they were standing in front of the House of Mirrors. The distorted reflections of the carnival stretched out in every direction, warping and twisting in the glass. "No," Sarah whispered, backing away. "We can't go in there." But the performers were closing in, their smiles widening as they herded Sarah and Mark toward the entrance of the House of Mirrors. The Harlequin waved cheerfully from the sidelines. "Enjoy the show, we'll be watching." Mark tried to pull Sarah away, but it was too late. The door to the House of Mirrors swung open and they were pushed inside by an unseen force. The door slammed shut behind them, leaving them in near total darkness. Sarah's breath came in short gasps as she fumbled for her flashlight. When she flicked it on, the light reflected off dozens of mirrors, casting strange shadows across the narrow corridor. Their reflections stretched and warped, the glass distorting their faces into grotesque shapes. Mark grabbed her hand, his grip tight. "Stay close." They moved through the maze of mirrors, their footsteps echoing in the empty space. The reflections around them seemed to move of their own accord, shifting and twisting in ways that made Sarah's stomach churn. Every corner they turned led to another dead end, another mirror reflecting their terrified faces back at them. "This isn't real," Sarah muttered to herself. "It's just a trick, just mirrors." But as they turned another corner, Sarah stopped short. Her reflection was gone. Where her face should have been in the mirror, there was only empty glass. "Mark," she whispered, her voice trembling. He looked at the mirror, his eyes widening in horror. "What the hell?" Before they could react, the glass rippled like water, and something moved within the reflection. A face appeared, human but wrong. Its eyes were too large, its smile too wide. It stared back at them with a hunger that made Sarah's skin crawl. And then it stepped out of the mirror. Sarah screamed as the figure emerged from the glass, its body twisting and contorting as it took shape in the real world. It was humanoid, but its limbs were too long, its skin stretched too tight over its bones. Its mouth opened in a wide, unnatural grin, revealing rows of sharp teeth. Mark pulled Sarah back, his eyes wild with fear. "Run!" They bolted down the corridor, their footsteps echoing off the mirrors as the creature followed, its long, spindly limbs skittering across the floor. The walls of the House of Mirrors seemed to close in around them, the reflections distorting further with every step. "We have to find a way out," Mark gasped, his eyes darting around in desperation. But there was no way out. Every corridor led to another dead end, another mirror that showed them distorted versions of themselves. And all the while, the creature followed, its movements erratic, its laughter echoing through the maze. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as they turned yet another corner, only to find themselves face to face with a massive, cracked mirror. Their reflections stared back at them, distorted and broken. "We're trapped," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Mark slammed his fists against the mirror, but it didn't budge. "There has to be a way out. There has to be." But before they could make another move, the mirror rippled again. This time, the glass didn't just ripple, it shattered. And from the shards emerged the true horror of the carnival. Part 4. Eldara, Weaver of Souls. The shattered pieces of the mirror swirled through the air like shards of ice, glittering as they formed a vortex of reflective fragments. Mark threw his arm in front of Sarah, pulling her back from the swirling glass. But it wasn't just the mirror that was changing. The walls of the House of Mirrors themselves seemed to bend and warp, transforming into thick, silken threads. As the shards of glass scattered, something crawled out from the gaping hole in the wall. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she saw the enormous, spider-like legs that emerged one by one. Then came the body, a grotesque fusion of human and arachnid, with a bulbous blackened abdomen covered in a web of glowing, pulsating veins, and at the front, a face, a woman's face, twisted and stretched over the creature's form, its eyes wide and unblinking, its mouth curled into a chilling smile. Eldara. Sarah and Mark stared in horror as the demon spider creature unfolded its legs, towering over them, its human face leering down at them with a sickening glee. The air was thick with the smell of decay and something sweet, like rotting fruit. "So many have come before you." Eldara's voice was a soft hiss echoing in the enclosed space. "So many souls eager to join my collection." Mark backed away, his hand still gripping Sarah's arm. What are you?" Eldara tilted her head, her face never losing that grotesque smile. "I am the heart of the Carnival of Shadows, the one who keeps the souls of those foolish enough to enter." Sarah's eyes darted around the room, searching for an exit, but there was none. The mirrors had transformed into a cocoon of thick webbing, trapping them inside. They were caught in Eldara's lair, with no way out. "You see?" Eldara continued, her voice dripping with malice. "Those who come to the carnival never leave. They become part of the show. Their bodies, their souls, are mine to weave into my web of eternal entertainment." Sarah's mind raced, her pulse pounding in her ears. They had to find a way out. There had to be something they could do. But the creature was too large, too powerful, and the webs were closing in around them. Eldara's legs clicked as she moved closer, her human face never blinking. "You will make a fine addition to my collection," she whispered, her voice now a low, soothing lullaby. "You will entertain for eternity." Mark lunged forward, his eyes blazing with determination. "Not if we have anything to say about it." He grabbed a large shard of broken mirror from the ground and swung it at Eldara's nearest leg. The jagged glass cut through the demon's leg with a sickening crunch, black ichor oozing from the wound. Eldara let out a screech, her human face contorting in pain, but the moment of victory was short-lived. The webs around them trembled, and more of the spider's limbs appeared from the walls, as if Eldara's body extended beyond just the creature before them. The room itself was alive with her presence, and they were trapped inside it. Sarah screamed as one of the spider's legs shot toward Mark, knocking him to the ground with a force that sent the shard of glass flying from his hand. She rushed to his side, trying to pull him to his feet, but Eldara loomed over them now, her face twisted into an expression of rage. "You cannot escape!" Eldara hissed, her voice rising in a crescendo of madness. "You belong to me now!" Sarah grabbed the shard of glass that Mark had dropped, her mind racing. There had to be something, some weakness, some way to fight back. But Eldara was closing in, her legs moving with horrifying speed, her face contorted into a look of pure malevolence. Without thinking, Sarah lunged forward, slashing at one of Eldara's many legs. The glass cut deep, and the demon screeched in agony. Black ichor sprayed across the floor, but Eldara didn't stop. Her legs lashed out, striking at Sarah and Mark with terrifying speed. In the chaos, Sarah realized something. Every time they damaged Eldara, the webs around them shook, as if the creature's body was connected to the very fabric of the House of Mirrors itself. "The webs!" Sarah shouted. "We have to destroy the webs!" Mark, still clutching his side in pain, nodded. He grabbed another piece of broken glass and slashed at the nearest webbing. As the sharp edge cut through the strands, the walls of the room shuddered, and Eldara let out another screech, her form flickering for a brief moment. "It's working!" Sarah yelled, slashing at another set of webs. The more they cut through the threads, the weaker Eldara seemed to become. Her form flickered, her legs twitching as if struggling to maintain their hold on the physical world. But Eldara wasn't done yet. With a furious roar, she lunged at them, her remaining legs flailing wildly. Sarah and Mark dodged as best they could, but one of the legs caught Sarah, sending her crashing into a nearby wall. The air was knocked from her lungs, and her vision blurred as she struggled to stay conscious. Mark, bleeding from a cut on his arm, continued to hack at the webs, determined to bring the creature down. But Eldara was closing in, her human face twisted in fury, her legs moving faster than ever. In a last-ditch effort, Sarah grabbed the shard of glass and hurled it at Eldara's face. The glass struck the demon's human visage, embedding itself deep in her cheek. Eldara let out an ear-splitting shriek, her body convulsing as the room around them shook violently. The webs snapped and unraveled, and the mirrors shattered once more, sending shards of glass flying in every direction. Eldara's form flickered and dissolved, her body disintegrating into nothingness as the carnival itself began to collapse. Sarah and Mark scrambled to their feet, racing toward what they hoped was the exit. The walls of the House of Mirrors fell away, and suddenly they were outside, standing in the clearing where the carnival had once been. The tent was gone. The rides were gone. The lights, the music, the performers, everything had vanished. It was just the two of them, standing alone in the quiet forest.
Part 5. The Carnival's Curse. Sarah and Mark stood in stunned silence, their breaths coming in shallow gasps as they tried to process what had just happened. The clearing where the carnival had once been was now empty, the towering trees of the Pine Barrens swaying gently in the breeze. There was no sign of the twisted rides, the grotesque performers, or Eldara. "Is it over?" Mark asked, his voice hoarse. Sarah wiped the sweat and dirt from her brow, her hands trembling. I think so." They turned in circles, scanning the clearing for any trace of the carnival, but it was as if it had never been there. Only the faint scent of rotting sweetness lingered in the air, a reminder of the nightmare they had just survived. "We need to get out of here," Mark said, his voice urgent, "before it comes back." Sarah nodded, her body still shaking with adrenaline. Together, they began to walk back through the forest, retracing their steps to the truck. The forest was eerily quiet, the oppressive weight of the carnival gone, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching them. As they reached the truck, Sarah paused, looking back toward the trees. For a brief moment, she thought she saw a flicker of light, like the glow of carnival lights in the distance. But when she blinked, it was gone. She climbed into the truck beside Mark, her heart heavy with the knowledge that they had barely escaped. But as they drove away from the Pine Barrens, she couldn't help but wonder, had they truly escaped? Or had the carnival simply let them go? For now. The end.
Story 3. The Frozen Hotel. Location: Hotel Axla, Ålesund, Norway. Part 1. Arrival at Hotel Axla. Freya Anderson had always loved the north. The jagged cliffs, the deep, pristine fjords, and the untamed wilderness of Norway had captured her heart since childhood. As a travel writer, she had spent years exploring remote places, seeking the untouched and forgotten corners of the world. When she heard the rumors about Hotel Axla, a once grand, now abandoned hotel nestled deep in the fjords near Ålesund, she knew she had to visit. The stories intrigued her. The hotel, built in the early 20th century, was a luxury retreat for wealthy travelers. But something had happened, something dark. Over the years, there had been unexplained disappearances during the winter months. Guests vanished without a trace, and the hotel was eventually abandoned. Some said it was haunted, others claimed it was cursed. But Freya was skeptical. To her, it sounded like the perfect setting for her next article, a piece debunking the superstitions of the locals and revealing the truth behind the eerie folklore. Freya's rental car crunched over the icy road as she neared the isolated hotel. The sun was beginning to set, casting a pale golden light over the snow-covered landscape. Towering mountains surrounded her, their peaks dusted with snow, and the fjord shimmered darkly in the fading light. It was beautiful, but also desolate. An empty, frozen world. She parked the car and stepped out, pulling her coat tightly around her. The cold hit her immediately, sharp and biting, seeping through her layers of clothing. The air was so crisp it felt like it could snap. Freya took a deep breath, exhaling a cloud of mist. Before her stood Hotel Axla, its once grand facade now crumbling with age and neglect. The windows were boarded up, and the tall wooden doors hung crooked on their hinges. Snow had piled up against the building, and the stone walls were streaked with dark stains of mold and frost. "This is it," she muttered to herself, pulling out her camera. She snapped a few photos, capturing the decaying grandeur of the place. Despite the disrepair, she could see how beautiful it must have been in its heyday. The architecture was stately, with tall columns and elaborate carvings. It was a shame the hotel had fallen into ruin. Freya approached the doors, hesitating for a moment. Locals had warned her not to come, especially in winter. They said that when the temperatures dropped and the snow blanketed the ground, something awoke in the hotel, something old and forgotten, tied to the ancient forest surrounding it. She shook off the thought. It was just a story, a piece of folklore meant to scare tourists. She was here to write about the truth, not fairy tales. With a firm push, she opened the door and stepped inside. The air inside the hotel was colder than outside, if that was possible. A deep chill settled into her bones as she looked around the lobby. The place was a ghost of what it once had been. The grand chandelier that hung from the ceiling was covered in cobwebs, its crystals dull and dirty. The floors were covered in a thick layer of dust, and the furniture had long since succumbed to rot. But there was something else. A presence. Freya couldn't put her finger on it, but the air felt heavy. She rubbed her arms, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled over her. It was just an old building, abandoned for years. Of course, it would feel eerie. She made her way through the lobby, her boots echoing in the empty space. The hotel's ballroom was her destination. From her research, she knew that the ballroom had been the heart of the hotel, a place where guests gathered for lavish parties, drinking champagne and dancing beneath the glow of the chandelier. Now, it was silent and empty, a forgotten relic. Freya stepped through the double doors into the ballroom. The large space was even more decayed than she had imagined. The ceiling was sagging in places, and the once beautiful parquet floor was warped and splintered. The grand piano in the corner was covered in a thick layer of dust, its keys yellowed with age. But what caught her attention was the cold. It was freezing in here, colder than the rest of the hotel. The windows, though boarded up, still let in drafts of icy air, and Freya's breath came out in visible puffs. She shivered, pulling her coat tighter around her body. Suddenly, there was a noise, a deep, raspy sound, like breathing, coming from somewhere in the ballroom. Freya froze. She held her breath, listening. The sound came again, louder this time. It was rhythmic, like the slow exhale of someone or something breathing in the shadows. Freya's heart raced, but she forced herself to stay calm. It could be anything. The wind, an animal, the old building settling. But as she strained to listen, she realized the sound was too deliberate, too consistent to be random. Taking a deep breath, she moved toward the source of the noise, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. Her footsteps were slow and careful as she approached the far end of the ballroom, where the shadows were deepest. The breathing grew louder. Then, out of the darkness, something moved. Part 2. Awakening the Skogsra. Freya stumbled back, her flashlight shaking in her hand as she tried to focus the beam on whatever had moved in the shadows. Her heart was hammering in her chest, and her breath came in short, panicked bursts. The darkness in the ballroom felt alive, pressing in around her as if it were trying to smother her. "Hello?" she called out, her voice barely more than a whisper. She half expected to hear the echo of her own voice in response. But there was nothing. Just the cold and that slow, raspy breathing. For a long moment, she stood frozen, her eyes darting from one shadow to the next. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the breathing stopped. Freya let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Her body trembled from a mix of fear and the bone-chilling cold. She needed to warm up, to think clearly. Maybe she was imagining things. Maybe the cold was playing tricks on her mind. She turned and hurried back toward the lobby, where she had seen an old rusted heating unit behind the reception desk. If she could get it working, she could at least warm the place up a bit. As she fiddled with the ancient controls, Freya's thoughts raced. The locals had warned her about this place. They had spoken of spirits and old legends tied to the forests. She had dismissed it all as folklore, but now, after what she had heard, what she thought she had seen, she wasn't so sure. The heating system rumbled to life with a loud clank, and Freya breathed a sigh of relief as warm air began to seep into the frozen building. She rubbed her hands together, hoping the warmth would chase away the strange chill that had settled over her. But even as the heat slowly spread through the room, Freya couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The air still felt heavy, oppressive, as though something unseen lingered just out of sight. Ignoring her growing unease, Freya decided to explore more of the hotel. She needed to gather more information, take more pictures for her article. The ballroom had been unsettling, but she wasn't about to let fear stop her. As she made her way through the winding corridors of the hotel, her flashlight flickering against the peeling wallpaper, she tried to shake off the strange feeling that had settled over her. The deeper she ventured into the building, the more it seemed like the hotel was alive. The walls groaned with age, and the floor creaked beneath her feet, as though the very structure was shifting around her. Freya entered what must have once been the dining room. The long tables were still set with tarnished silverware and dusty plates, as if the guests had simply gotten up and walked away in the middle of a meal. Cobwebs draped over the chairs, and the chandelier above hung crookedly, swaying ever so slightly as if stirred by a breeze. But there was no breeze. The air in the room was still, almost suffocating in its silence. Freya's eyes scanned the room, taking in the eerie scene. She could almost imagine the hotel in its glory days, filled with the sound of laughter and music, the clinking of glasses, and the murmur of conversation. Now it was nothing but a ghost of the past. She turned to leave, but as she did, something caught her eye. A figure standing at the far end of the room, half hidden in the shadows. Freya's blood ran cold. The figure was tall and gaunt, its skin pale and frostbitten, with long, thin limbs that seemed too elongated for a human. Its hollow eyes stared at her from across the room, and its mouth hung open in a grotesque, twisted smile. Frost clung to its hair and clothes, and its entire body seemed to pulse with cold. Freya's heart raced, her breath catching in her throat. She wanted to run, but her legs felt rooted to the spot. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, watching her with those empty, hollow eyes. Then, slowly, it began to move forward, its steps slow and deliberate, as though it had all the time in the world. With each step it took, the temperature in the room plummeted. Freya could see her breath again, forming clouds in the air. She took a step back, her hands trembling as she gripped the flashlight. The beam flickered and sputtered, the light fading in and out. "No," Freya whispered, her voice shaking. The figure moved closer, its smile widening. It raised one of its long, skeletal hands, and Freya could see frost forming on the floor where it walked, spreading out like a web of ice. It was then that she understood. This was the Skogsra, the ancient Norse spirit, protector of the forests. But something had changed. It wasn't here to protect anymore. It had been forgotten, abandoned, and now it was something else, something twisted and malevolent. Freya turned and ran. She didn't care where she was going. She just needed to get away, to escape the icy grip of the creature. Her footsteps echoed through the empty halls as she sprinted down the corridors, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind her she could hear it, the sound of frost cracking, the slow, deliberate footsteps of the Skogsra as it followed her. Freya skidded to a stop as she reached the stairwell, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't go back to the ballroom. She couldn't hide. She had to find a way out. But as she looked up the staircase, she saw something that made her stomach drop. The entire stairwell was covered in frost. The steps were coated in a thick layer of ice, the banister gleaming with a deadly cold. There was no escape. Part 3. The Hotel's Secret. Freya's breath came in shallow, panicked gasps as she backed away from the frozen stairwell. The Skogsra was close now. She could feel it in the air, the cold tightening its grip around her. She had to think, had to find a way out before the creature caught up to her. She stumbled back down the hall, her mind racing. If the stairwell was blocked, maybe there was another way out. She remembered seeing a service entrance near the kitchen earlier. If she could reach it, maybe, just maybe, she could escape. Freya turned and ran, her footsteps echoing in the silence of the hotel. The halls seemed to stretch out endlessly before her, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. It was as if the hotel itself was alive, warping around her, trying to trap her. As she rounded a corner, she skidded to a stop, nearly colliding with a door that hadn't been there before. She stared at it, her heart pounding. It was an old, weathered wooden door, slightly ajar, and through the crack, she could see a faint, flickering light. Freya hesitated. She hadn't seen this door on her earlier exploration of the hotel, and something about it felt wrong, like it shouldn't be there. But the sound of the Skogsra's slow, deliberate steps echoed behind her, growing louder. She didn't have a choice. Freya pushed the door open and stepped inside, pulling it shut behind her. She leaned against it, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. The room she found herself in was small and dimly lit, with a single flickering lantern hanging from the ceiling. It looked like an old storeroom, filled with dusty shelves and broken furniture. But as Freya's eyes adjusted to the dim light, she noticed something strange. At the far end of the room, partially obscured by the shadows, was a large, ornate mirror. Freya approached it cautiously, her heart still racing. The mirror was old, its surface tarnished and covered in a fine layer of frost. But there was something about it that drew her in, something familiar. As she stood before it, Freya felt a chill run down her spine. She stared at her reflection, but it wasn't quite right. The woman in the mirror looked like her, but her skin was pale, her eyes hollow and empty, just like the Skogsra. Freya's breath caught in her throat. Was this a trick of the light? A hallucination brought on by the cold and fear? But as she watched, the reflection in the mirror began to move on its own. Freya stepped back, her heart pounding in her chest. The woman in the mirror smiled, a cold, twisted smile that didn't belong to her. And then, slowly she raised her hand, pointing directly at Freya. "What "What is this?" Freya whispered, her voice trembling. The mirror began to shimmer, its surface rippling like water. Freya's reflection flickered and disappeared, replaced by a scene that made her blood run cold. She saw the ballroom, no longer decayed and crumbling, but restored to its former glory. Guests in elegant clothing danced beneath the chandelier, their laughter echoing through the air. But their faces were wrong, pale and lifeless, their eyes empty, their movements stiff and unnatural. And at the center of it all stood the Skogsra. The creature moved gracefully among the guests, its frostbitten skin gleaming in the light. It smiled, its hollow eyes scanning the room as if searching for something, or someone. Freya stumbled back, her heart racing. This couldn't be real. It was a nightmare, a trick of her mind. But the mirror shimmered again, and the image changed. Now she saw the hotel's past, its construction, its grand opening. Guests flocked to the remote retreat, drawn by its luxury and the beauty of the surrounding fjords. But there was something darker hidden beneath the surface. Freya watched in horror as she saw glimpses of the disappearances, guests vanishing in the dead of winter, never to be seen again. The hotel owners tried to cover it up, but the story spread, and soon, no one dared visit Hotel Axla during the winter months. And then, the image shifted once more. Freya saw herself. She stood in the ballroom, her breath visible in the cold air. The Skogsra was behind her, its hollow eyes fixed on her as it slowly approached. Freya's blood ran cold. It wasn't just a legend. The Skogsra had been here all along, waiting for someone to wake it, to release it from its long slumber. And she had done it. The mirror flickered, and the image disappeared, leaving Freya staring at her own reflection once more. She backed away from the mirror, her mind racing. She had to get out of here. She had to escape before the Skogsra found her. But as she turned to leave the room, the door creaked open, and the cold, raspy breathing filled the air once more. Freya froze. The Skogsra was standing in the doorway, its hollow eyes fixed on her, its twisted smile widening. Part 4. The final confrontation. Freya's mind screamed at her to run, but her body was frozen in place. The Skogsra stood before her, its frostbitten skin glowing in the dim light, its breath visible in the cold air. It took a slow step forward, the air around it growing colder with each movement. Freya forced herself to move, to think. She couldn't fight this thing. It wasn't human, but she couldn't let it take her. Not like the others. She glanced around the room, her eyes landing on the lantern hanging from the ceiling, the only source of warmth, however small. The Skogsra was drawn to warmth, she remembered. The locals had said it was attracted to heat, to life. An idea began to form in Freya's mind. It was dangerous, maybe even suicidal, but it was the only chance she had. The Skogsra took another step closer, its empty eyes locked on her. Freya's breath hitched in her throat as she reached for the lantern. She grabbed it and held it up, watching as the creature's gaze shifted to the light. The Skogsra hesitated, its expression flickering for a moment. Freya's heart pounded. The heat. It was drawn to the heat. Without thinking, she threw the lantern at the Skogsra. The lantern shattered against the creature's body, spilling oil and flames across its frostbitten skin. For a moment, the Skogsra let out a screech of pain, its body writhing as the flames licked at it. The room filled with the acrid smell of burning frost and smoke, but it wasn't enough. The flames died quickly, snuffed out by the creature's icy presence. The Skogsra's twisted smile returned, its eyes gleaming with malice as it took another step toward her. Freya's pulse raced. The lantern had slowed it, but it hadn't stopped it. She needed more heat, something stronger, something that could destroy the creature once and for all. Her mind raced, searching for an answer. And then she remembered. The heating system. Freya turned and bolted from the room, the sound of the Skogsra's raspy breathing following close behind. She sprinted through the winding corridors of the hotel, her feet slipping on the icy floor. Behind her, she could hear the creature's footsteps, slow and deliberate, always just a few steps behind. She reached the lobby, her eyes scanning the room for the old heating unit. There it was, rusted and ancient, barely functioning. But it was her only hope. Freya skidded to a stop in front of the unit and yanked open the control panel. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the dials, trying to crank the heat as high as it would go. The unit groaned in protest, but it sputtered to life, releasing a blast of hot air into the room. The temperature rose rapidly, the heat spreading through the lobby. Freya could feel the warmth on her skin, and for a moment, she allowed herself to hope. But then the Skogsra appeared at the far end of the room, its frostbitten body steaming as the heat washed over it. The creature's smile faltered, its steps slowing as it entered the warm air. Freya didn't wait. She grabbed a heavy iron fire poker from the hearth and lunged at the Skogsra. The creature let out a screech of rage as the hot metal struck its icy skin, the heat searing into its flesh. Freya swung again and again, driving the poker into the creature's body. The heat from the unit was overwhelming now, filling the room with a stifling warmth that made it hard to breathe. The Skogsra staggered back, its body writhing as it tried to escape the heat. Its skin was blistering, cracking under the intense warmth, and for the first time, Freya saw fear in its hollow eyes. With one final swing, Freya drove the fire poker deep into the Skogsra's chest. The creature let out a blood-curdling scream, its body convulsing as it disintegrated into a cloud of frost and smoke. The air crackled with cold as the last remnants of the Skogsra dissolved into nothingness. Freya collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. The heat from the unit still filled the room, but the cold presence of the Skogsra was gone. It was over. Part 5. The Aftermath. Freya sat on the floor of the lobby, her body trembling from exhaustion. The heat from the old unit was still pumping through the room, but the oppressive cold that had followed the Skogsra was gone. She glanced around the dilapidated lobby, now bathed in an unnatural warmth. It felt surreal, like a dream. Had it all really happened? The frostbitten creature, the breathing, the chase through the hotel? Freya's hands shook as she pushed herself to her feet. She had survived. Somehow, she had made it through. She stumbled toward the front doors of the hotel, her legs weak and unsteady. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on her like a heavy blanket, but she couldn't stay here any longer. She had to leave this place. As she stepped outside into the cold, crisp air of the Norwegian winter, Freya felt a strange sense of relief wash over her. The fjords stretched out before her, peaceful and silent, untouched by the horrors she had just faced. She turned back to look at Hotel Axla one last time, its once grand facade now crumbling with age and decay. The stories had been true. The legends weren't just superstition. There was something ancient and evil in that hotel, something that had been waiting to be awakened. And she had awakened it. But now, it was over. The Skogsra was gone, and she had lived to tell the tale. Freya took a deep breath, her breath visible in the cold air. She pulled her coat tighter around her and began the long walk back to her car, the frozen landscape silent around her. But as she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her. The end. Story 4. The Vault Below. Location: Catacombs of Paris, France. Part 1. The Forbidden Door. Etienne Lambert stood at the mouth of the tunnel, his flashlight beam cutting through the oppressive darkness of the Paris catacombs. The air was thick with the scent of damp stone and ancient bones, and the temperature had dropped sharply since he had descended into this forgotten part of the catacombs. He checked his map again, tracing the route he had taken through the labyrinthine passages beneath the city. The sealed-off section he had heard about in hushed whispers was supposed to be somewhere ahead. As an amateur archaeologist, Etienne had spent years exploring historical sites across France, but the catacombs had always fascinated him. The vast underground necropolis held secrets stretching back centuries, but it was the stories of a hidden vault that had captured his imagination. For years, Rumors had circulated among archaeologists and historians, whispers of a part of the catacombs that predated the French Revolution, perhaps even the Roman occupation of Gaul. But Etienne had found something that few others had: a lead. A crumbling, obscure map he had discovered in a dusty archive led him to believe that the vault lay somewhere beyond the sealed-off passages of the catacombs. And now, after months of preparation, he was here, standing on the brink of what he hoped would be the discovery of a lifetime. His heart pounded with a mixture of excitement and trepidation as he approached the end of the tunnel. The passage narrowed until it opened into a small, circular chamber. In the center of the room stood a massive stone door, carved with strange symbols that Etienne had never seen before. The door was ancient, far older than anything else he had encountered in the catacombs. The stone was dark, almost black, and the carvings seemed to writhe and twist in the flickering light of his flashlight. Etienne stepped closer, brushing his fingers over the surface of the door. The stone was cold, far colder than the air around it, and as he touched it, a shiver ran down his spine. There was something wrong about this place, something ancient and malevolent that seemed to seep from the very walls. But Etienne pushed his unease aside. This was what he had been searching for. If he could open the door, he would be the first to explore whatever lay beyond it, the first to uncover the secrets of the vault. He knelt in front of the door, examining the symbols more closely. They were unlike any script he had studied before, but there was a pattern to them, a sequence that he could almost understand. After a few moments, he found what appeared to be a latch mechanism embedded in the stone. It was worn with age, barely visible beneath the layers of dust and grime, but it was there. Etienne hesitated for only a moment before he reached out and pulled the latch. With a deep, resonant groan, the stone door shifted. Dust cascaded from the ceiling as the ancient mechanism ground into motion. Etienne stepped back as the door slowly swung open, revealing a narrow passage beyond. The air that wafted out was stale and thick, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of decay. Etienne's flashlight flickered as he stepped into the passage, the beam cutting through the darkness to reveal stone walls lined with strange carvings, serpentine figures coiling around skeletal forms, their faces twisted in agony. Etienne's pulse quickened. He had never seen anything like this before. The carvings were ancient, far older than anything in Paris, possibly older than the city itself. What civilization had created this vault? What had they worshipped here, in the depths of the earth? He moved deeper into the passage, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The air grew colder the further he went, and the carvings became more elaborate, depicting scenes of ritual sacrifice and strange serpentine creatures with coal-black scales and hollow eyes. Etienne stopped as he reached the end of the passage. Before him stood a massive stone altar, carved from the same dark stone as the door. It was covered in strange markings, and at its center lay a figure, a serpent-like creature coiled around itself, with scales the color of ash, and a face that resembled the decayed skeletal head of a dragon. Etienne's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the figure. This was it. The creature the ancient cult had worshipped, the god they had sacrificed to. Narun. He had read the name in passing once, in a long-forgotten book of ancient myths and legends. Narun was a serpent deity, worshipped by a lost civilization that had vanished long before recorded history. The cult had believed that Narun would grant them eternal life in exchange for human souls, souls that would feed the creature and keep it alive, waiting in the darkness. Etienne felt a cold chill crawl down his spine. The altar, the carvings, the sealed door, they had all been part of a ritual to keep Narun sealed away, buried beneath the city. But the door had opened. Etienne backed away from the altar, his heart racing. He had to leave. Whatever this place was, it was far more dangerous than he had imagined. The vault was a prison, not a tomb. But as he turned to leave, a low hissing sound filled the air. Etienne froze, his flashlight flickering as the temperature in the vault dropped even further. The sound grew louder, echoing through the chamber, and from the shadows, something moved. Part 2. Awakening the Ancient One. Etienne's hand tightened around his flashlight as he swung the beam toward the source of the sound. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. For a moment, he saw nothing but darkness and stone. But then, something shifted in the shadows. A pair of gleaming eyes, hollow and cold, stared back at him from the far end of the vault. Etienne took a step back, his pulse racing. The eyes were enormous, far too large to belong to any living creature he had ever seen. They glowed faintly, reflecting the light of his flashlight, and as he stared into them, he felt a wave of nausea wash over him. The air around him grew thick, suffocating, as if the very walls of the vault were closing in. The hissing sound grew louder, more insistent, and from the shadows, a massive shape began to emerge. The creature that slithered out of the darkness was unlike anything Etienne had ever seen. Its body was long and serpentine, covered in coal-black scales that seemed to absorb the light. It moved with an unnatural grace, its body coiling and uncoiling as it advanced, each movement accompanied by the sickening scrape of scales against stone. But it was the creature's face that sent a bolt of terror through Etienne's heart. The head was that of a decayed skeletal dragon, its flesh rotted away to reveal gleaming bone. Hollow eye sockets stared out at him, and its mouth was lined with jagged teeth, long and sharp, dripping with a viscous, black fluid. Its jaws opened, and the hissing sound became a low, guttural growl, reverberating through the stone walls of the vault. This was Nahrun, the serpent god the ancient cult had worshipped, the creature they had sealed away to protect the world from its wrath. And now, it was awake. Etienne stumbled back, his mind racing. He had to get out of here. He had to run. But his legs felt like lead, frozen in place by the creature's gaze. Nahrun's eyes burned into his soul, filling him with an overwhelming sense of dread, of hopelessness. The creature slithered closer, its massive body filling the chamber, its presence suffocating. Etienne could feel the cold radiating from it, chilling him to his core. His breath came in short, ragged gasps, his body trembling with fear. He had to move. He had to escape. With a surge of adrenaline, Etienne turned and bolted toward the passageway. His footsteps echoed in the narrow tunnel as he ran, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly in the darkness. Behind him, he could hear the sound of Nahrun's massive body scraping against the stone, the hissing growing louder, more furious. Etienne's mind raced as he navigated the twisting tunnels of the catacombs, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't let Nahrun escape. The creature was ancient, powerful, far more dangerous than anything he had ever imagined. If it reached the surface, there was no telling what it would do. The cult had sealed it away for a reason, and now, because of him, it was free. As he ran, the air grew colder, the walls of the catacombs closing in around him. Etienne's breath came in ragged gasps, his lungs burning from the exertion. But no matter how fast he ran, he could still hear the creature behind him, its massive body slithering through the tunnels, its growls echoing in the darkness. The tunnels twisted and turned, leading Etienne deeper into the catacombs. His flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. He could barely see where he was going, but he had no choice. He had to keep moving. He rounded a corner, his heart skipping a beat as he saw a narrow staircase leading upward. Etienne sprinted toward it, his legs burning with exhaustion. If he could just reach the surface, he could warn someone, anyone, about what he had found. But as he reached the base of the staircase, something cold and sharp wrapped around his ankle. Etienne screamed as he was yanked off his feet, his flashlight flying from his hand and clattering to the floor. He hit the ground hard, the air knocked from his lungs. Pain shot through his body as he struggled to free himself, his hands clawing at the ground. But the grip on his ankle tightened, pulling him back into the darkness. Etienne looked over his shoulder, his heart pounding with terror. Nahrun's massive, coal-black body was coiled around his leg, its scales shimmering in the dim light. The creature's hollow eyes gleamed with malice as it pulled him closer, its jaws opening wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Etienne screamed again, his voice echoing through the catacombs as he clawed at the ground, trying desperately to escape. But the creature was too strong, too fast. It dragged him back into the tunnel, its massive body coiling around him, squeezing the life from his lungs. Etienne gasped for breath, his vision blurring as the cold, crushing pressure wrapped around his chest. Narun's face loomed over him, its hollow eyes burning into his soul. Etienne could feel the life draining from his body, his strength fading as the creature's jaws closed in. In his final moments, Etienne realized the truth. The vault had never been a prison for Narun. It had been a feeding ground. Part 3. The Truth of Narun. Etienne's body ached as consciousness slowly returned to him. His chest heaved with labored breaths, the weight of something cold and heavy pressing down on him. He blinked, his vision blurry, the dark tunnel coming into focus. He wasn't dead. Narun's massive body still coiled around him, its scales pressing into his flesh, but the creature hadn't finished him off. It hovered above him, its hollow eyes watching him intently. Etienne could feel its cold breath on his skin, the sickening scent of decay filling the air. Why hadn't it killed him? Etienne's mind raced, his thoughts muddled by pain and fear. The creature had been dragging him deeper into the catacombs, pulling him away from the surface, from any hope of escape. But it hadn't finished him yet. The realization sent a shiver down his spine. Narun wasn't just a predator. It was something far more terrifying. The creature fed on life itself. Etienne could feel it now, the slow, steady drain of his energy, his life force being siphoned away by the creature's presence. Narun was feeding, but it wasn't in a rush. It was savoring its prey, taking its time to drain him of everything he had. His strength, his vitality. Everything was slipping away, leaving him weaker by the second. The creature let out a low, guttural growl, its massive head lowering until its skeletal face was mere inches from Etienne's. The hollow eyes bored into him, and for a moment, Etienne thought he could hear something, whispers, faint and distant, echoing through the creature's mind. The voice was ancient, cold, filled with malice. "You opened the door. You woke me." Etienne's heart pounded in his chest. The voice wasn't his own, and it wasn't coming from Narun's mouth. It was inside his head, speaking directly to his thoughts. "You brought me back." Etienne gasped, his breath shallow and weak. He had to do something. He couldn't just lie here, waiting to die, waiting to be drained dry. But Narun's body was coiled too tightly around him, its grip unyielding. The creature's jaws parted, revealing the black void of its throat. Etienne's pulse quickened, the cold fear surging through him as he realized what was about to happen. The creature was going to consume him. But then, something strange happened. Narun hesitated. The hollow eyes, which had been burning with cold malice, flickered for a moment. Etienne could feel the shift in the air, the slight release of pressure around his chest. The creature was distracted. Etienne's mind raced. What had changed? What had caused Narun to hesitate? And then, he realized. The vault. The ancient seal that had kept Narun trapped for centuries. It hadn't just kept the creature locked away. It had been part of a ritual that had bound Narun's power, preventing it from fully manifesting in the world above. And now that the seal was broken, the creature was vulnerable. Etienne's eyes darted around the tunnel, searching for anything that could help him. His flashlight had been lost somewhere in the struggle, but the stone walls around him were etched with carvings, ancient symbols of protection, of power. He had to break free. He had to find a way to use the carvings to rebind the creature before it fully awakened. With a surge of desperate strength, Etienne wrenched his arm free from the creature's coils. His fingers scraped against the cold stone floor, searching for anything he could use. His hand closed around a jagged piece of stone, and without hesitation, he drove it into the creature's body. Narun let out a deafening screech, its massive form convulsing in pain. Etienne seized the opportunity, ripping himself free from the creature's grasp. He stumbled to his feet, his legs shaking with exhaustion, and backed away from the writhing serpent. The creature's hollow eyes locked onto him, burning with fury. But Etienne wasn't done yet. He turned and ran, his footsteps echoing through the tunnel as he sprinted toward the carvings on the wall. The symbols seemed to pulse with energy, glowing faintly in the darkness. Etienne's mind raced as he tried to remember the ancient rituals he had studied, the stories of how ancient civilizations had trapped and bound the gods they had worshipped. His fingers traced the carvings, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The symbols were complex, but he could feel the power thrumming beneath them, waiting to be unleashed. Etienne closed his eyes, his hand trembling as he whispered the words he had read in the old texts. The ancient language felt foreign on his tongue, but the power behind it was undeniable. The air around him shifted, growing heavy with energy. The carvings on the wall glowed brighter, pulsing with a strange, otherworldly light. Nahruun let out another screech, its massive body thrashing against the stone walls as it tried to reach Etienne. But the creature was too late. The symbols flared to life and a wave of energy surged through the tunnel, slamming into the creature with the force of a tidal wave. Nahruun's body convulsed, its hollow eyes wide with fury as it was dragged back into the darkness. Etienne collapsed to the ground, his body trembling with exhaustion. The air was thick with the smell of burning stone and decay, but the creature was gone. For now. Part 4. The Price of Awakening. Etienne lay on the cold stone floor of the catacombs, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. The tunnel was silent now, the oppressive weight of Nahruun's presence lifted. But the victory felt hollow. He had bound the creature, yes, but it was still there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for the chance to escape again. The ancient seal had been weakened, and Etienne knew that it would not hold forever. The creature had tasted freedom, and it would not rest until it was free once more. Slowly, painfully, Etienne pushed himself to his feet. His body ached, his muscles screaming in protest, but he couldn't stay here. He had to leave the catacombs before Nahruun found a way to break the binding. He had to warn someone, anyone, about the danger that still lurked beneath the streets of Paris. He stumbled through the twisting tunnels, his hand brushing against the cold stone walls for support. His flashlight was long gone, lost in the struggle with the creature, but he didn't need it. He knew these tunnels. He had spent years studying them, memorizing their twists and turns. But now, as he made his way through the darkness, something felt different. The air was thicker, heavier, as if the very walls were pressing in on him. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the sound of his ragged breathing and the faint echo of his footsteps. And then, he heard it. A faint, rasping breath. The sound of something moving in the darkness. Etienne's heart skipped a beat. He spun around, his eyes wide as he scanned the tunnel behind him. But there was nothing. Just the darkness. He took a step forward, his body tense, every muscle ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. But the rasping breath grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the tunnel ahead. Etienne's pulse quickened. Nahruun was bound. He had seen the ritual work, but the creature was ancient, powerful, and its influence still lingered in the catacombs. He moved cautiously, his hand trembling as he reached for the stone wall to steady himself. The rasping breath was louder now, almost as if it were right next to him. He could feel the cold air pressing against his skin, seeping into his bones. And then, out of the darkness, something moved. Etienne stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. He strained to see in the darkness, his eyes wide, but the faint light from the carvings was too dim to reveal whatever was lurking ahead. The rasping breath grew louder, closer. Etienne's mind raced, his pulse quickening. He had to get out of here. He couldn't face whatever this was, not after everything that had happened. He turned and ran, his footsteps echoing through the tunnel as he sprinted toward the surface. The cold air pressed against him, chilling him to the core. The rasping breath followed him, growing louder with every step. Etienne's lungs burned as he ran, his body screaming for rest. But he couldn't stop. He couldn't let whatever was behind him catch him. The tunnel twisted and turned, the walls closing in around him. Etienne's legs burned with exhaustion, but he pushed himself harder, his heart pounding in his chest. He could see the faint light of the surface ahead, just a few more steps. The floor gave way beneath him. Etienne screamed as he fell, his body plummeting into the darkness below. The cold air rushed past him, and then, with a sickening thud, he hit the ground. Pain shot through his body as he lay on the cold stone floor, gasping for breath. His vision swam, the world spinning around him. He tried to push himself to his feet, but his body refused to cooperate. Every muscle ached, every bone felt as if it had been shattered. The rasping breath was louder now, almost deafening. Etienne's pulse quickened, panic surging through him as he struggled to move. But his body wouldn't respond. He was too weak, too broken. And then, out of the darkness, it came. The creature slithered toward him, its coal-black scales glistening in the dim light. Nahrun's hollow eyes gleamed with malice as it approached, its massive body coiling around Etienne. The creature's jaws parted, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Etienne's breath hitched in his throat, his body trembling with fear. The binding hadn't worked. Nahrun was free. The creature's cold breath washed over him, and Etienne could feel the life draining from his body, his strength, his vitality. It was all slipping away, drawn into the creature's maw. Etienne's vision blurred, the world fading into darkness as the creature fed. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat slower than the last. And then, there was nothing. Part 5. The Vault's New Guardian. The catacombs of Paris were silent once more, the ancient tunnels filled with the cold, oppressive stillness of the forgotten dead. The air was thick with the scent of damp stone and decay, and the faint echoes of distant footsteps whispered through the darkness. Deep beneath the city, in the hidden vault that had remained sealed for centuries, Nahrun stirred. The serpent god coiled around the stone altar, its hollow eyes gleaming in the dim light of the carvings on the walls. The ancient symbols glowed faintly, their power weakened but still present, holding the creature in a tenuous bond. But the bond was fragile, fraying at the edges. Nahrun had tasted freedom once more, and it would not be denied. The creature's massive body shifted, scales scraping against the stone as it moved. It had fed, drawing strength from the life force of the one who had dared to awaken it. But it was not yet enough. It needed more. More souls, more life to fuel its escape. And it would find them. The ancient vault was no longer a prison. It was a doorway, a gateway to the world above. The creature's influence seeped through the tunnels, reaching out into the streets of Paris, calling to those who would stumble upon the hidden passageways. It had all the time in the world. It would wait, patiently, until the next unfortunate soul found the vault below. And when they did, Nahrun would be ready. For the binding was weakening, and soon, the creature would be free once more. And this time, nothing would stop it. The end. Story 5. The Farmhouse's Harvest. Location: Black Hollow Farm, Kansas, USA. Part 1. The Allure of Abandonment. The road stretched out like a gray ribbon beneath a sky heavy with the promise of rain. Rachel Palmer watched as the flat Kansas landscape unfurled in front of her. Fields of withered corn and golden wheat lining both sides of the narrow highway. Her camera bag sat beside her on the passenger seat, a constant reminder of why she had driven so far from the city. Black Hollow Farm had become a legend among urban explorers and photographers alike, a place frozen in time, untouched by human hands since the 1920s. Rachel had stumbled upon the story while researching abandoned places to photograph for her next project. According to the sparse details she found online, the farm had been abandoned after the entire farming family disappeared during the harvest season. No one knew exactly what had happened to them, but locals avoided the place. whispering of curses and hauntings. For Rachel, the eerie isolation and haunting history of Black Hollow Farm made it irresistible. She had a knack for capturing the forgotten beauty of decaying buildings, finding a strange serenity in the ruins of human life. The farmhouse and barn at Black Hollow, with their collapsing walls and broken windows, would make for the perfect subject. She turned off the main highway onto a dirt road, her car bumping over the uneven terrain as she neared the farm. The cornfields stretched endlessly on both sides of the road, their stalks dry and brittle, rustling faintly in the breeze. Rachel could see the farmhouse in the distance now, a dark silhouette against the overcast sky, Black Hollow. The name conjured images of desolation, and as she drew closer, Rachel could feel a growing sense of unease settle over her. The farmhouse and barn loomed larger now, their sagging roofs and crumbling walls barely visible through the tangle of overgrown weeds. There was something off about the place, something that made her hesitate. Rachel shook off the feeling. She was here for the photographs. Whatever strange history the farm held, it was long buried in the past. She parked her car at the edge of the property and stepped out, the air cool and heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. She pulled her camera from the bag and began snapping photos as she walked toward the house. The soft click of the shutter echoed in the stillness as she captured the peeling paint on the barn door, the shattered windows of the farmhouse, the rusted tractor half buried in the weeds. The place was perfect, just as she had imagined it, a monument to time's passage, eerie and beautiful in its ruin. Rachel stepped closer to the house, her camera focused on the sagging front porch. The wood creaked ominously under her feet as she walked up the steps, peering through the broken window into the darkness inside. She could make out the remnants of old furniture, an overturned chair, a table covered in dust, and something hanging from the ceiling. She paused, her heart skipping a beat as she squinted through the dirty glass. The thing hanging from the ceiling looked like a bundle of old clothes or rags suspended by a rope. It swayed gently, though there was no breeze. She raised her camera, zooming in for a better look. The closer she got, the more the shape became clear. An old scarecrow, its burlap body worn and tattered, its head slumped to one side. Rachel exhaled, feeling a brief flutter of relief. Just a scarecrow. She stepped back from the window and made her way around to the back of the house, where the barn stood. Its roof had caved in on one side, and ivy crept up its wooden walls. The door hung crookedly on its hinges, barely attached to the frame. Rachel pushed it open and stepped inside, the musty smell of old hay and decay hitting her like a wave. Inside, the barn was filled with the remnants of farm life, rusted tools, broken barrels, and piles of dry, crumbling hay. She snapped a few photos of the old tractor parked near the far wall, its wheels half buried in dirt and debris. As she moved deeper into the barn, something caught her eye, a glint of metal near the ceiling. She tilted her head, squinting to get a better view. There, high up in the rafters, were figures, 5 of them. They were strung up like scarecrows, their bodies hanging limp and lifeless, their heads slumped forward. Rachel froze. Her mind raced. At first she thought they were more scarecrows, just like the one in the house. But as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she realized with growing horror that these were not scarecrows. They were people, or at least, they had been. The figures were human-shaped, but their bodies were grotesquely elongated, their skins stretched tight over their bones like parchment. Their arms and legs dangled awkwardly, as if they had been drained of all life, and their faces, hollow, eyeless sockets, stared down at her from the rafters, their mouths open in silent, eternal screams. Rachel stumbled back, her stomach churning as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. Who or what had done this? Suddenly, from somewhere outside came a sound, the soft rustling of corn stalks in the wind, but there was no wind. Part 2. The harvest begins. The rustling grew louder, persistent, as if something was moving through the cornfields just beyond the barn. Rachel's breath hitched in her throat as she turned toward the open door. the soft noise sending a cold shiver down her spine. The field stretched out in every direction, endless rows of tall, brittle corn swaying gently in the still air. Her hand trembled as she raised her camera, peering through the lens at the fields beyond. The zoom revealed nothing at first, just dry stalks and weeds. But then, in the distance, something moved. Rachel froze, her finger hovering over the shutter button. A figure was moving through the rows of corn, its tall form just barely visible above the stalks. It walked with a strange, jerking motion, its limbs unnaturally long and thin. She adjusted the focus, trying to get a clearer look, but the figure disappeared behind the corn before she could snap a picture. Her heart pounded in her chest, a mix of fear and curiosity gnawing at her. Who would be out here? The farm had been abandoned for decades, and she hadn't seen a single soul since she arrived. Maybe it was just a drifter, or some local farmer checking the fields. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. The rustling came again, closer this time. Rachel took a step back, her eyes darting around the barn as the sound seemed to circle the building, moving from one side to the other. It was as if someone, or something, was moving through the corn, surrounding her. Her stomach churned with unease, and she backed away from the door, her camera still clutched tightly in her hands. She needed to leave, now. As she turned to head back toward the farmhouse, her foot caught on something and she stumbled, nearly dropping her camera. She glanced down, her breath catching in her throat. A hand, skeletal and gray, was protruding from the dirt floor of the barn, its fingers curled as if reaching for her. Rachel recoiled, her heart slamming against her ribs. She stared at the hand, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. The hand looked human, but it was desiccated, the skin stretched tight over bone, its fingernails long and blackened with rot. She took a shaky step back, her eyes scanning the rest of the barn floor. There were more, half-buried bodies, their limbs twisted and broken, poking up through the dirt. The ground was littered with them, as if they had been planted there, left to rot beneath the hay and debris. Rachel felt bile rise in her throat, but she forced it down, her legs trembling as she backed toward the barn door. She had to get out of here. This place wasn't just abandoned, it was a graveyard. The rustling came again, louder now, followed by a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. Rachel whipped around, her eyes scanning the cornfields. Figures were emerging from the rows of corn, their bodies tall and thin, moving with jerking, unnatural motions. Their skin was like burlap, rough and brown, stitched together with thick wire that gleamed in the fading light. Their arms were long, too long, ending in sharp, bony fingers that dragged along the ground as they walked. The harvesters. Rachel's blood ran cold. The legend of Black Hollow Farm had mentioned creatures, harvesters that came to reap the crops. But when there was no harvest, they turned to flesh and bone. She had thought it was just another ghost story, a way for locals to explain the disappearances. But now the truth stood before her. They weren't ghosts. They were real, and they were coming for her. The harvesters moved slowly at first, their hollow eyes fixed on Rachel as they advanced from the cornfields. Their steps were deliberate, almost lazy, as if they knew there was no rush. She was already caught in their trap. Panic surged through her veins as she bolted out of the barn, running for the farmhouse. The ground felt uneven beneath her feet, but she didn't dare stop. She could hear the soft rustling behind her, growing louder with each step. She stumbled up the steps of the porch, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she threw herself against the door. It gave way under her weight, and she tumbled inside, slamming the door shut behind her. The farmhouse was dark, the air thick with the scent of mold and decay. Rachel's eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything that could help her. The furniture was overturned, broken, and covered in dust, and the walls were cracked and crumbling. The soft rustling outside grew louder. The harvesters were closing in. Rachel rushed to the windows, her hands shaking as she peered through the dirty glass. The figures were moving through the fields, their burlap bodies swaying as they reached the edge of the porch. She could see them more clearly now. Their faces were blank, stitched with wire, their mouths nothing more than dark slits. Their hollow eyes stared up at the house, and for a moment, they stood still, as if waiting. Rachel backed away from the window, her heart hammering in her chest. She needed to hide, to find a place where they couldn't reach her. She turned and ran up the stairs, her footsteps echoing through the empty house. At the top of the stairs, she found herself in a long hallway lined with doors. Most of them were closed, but one at the far end was slightly ajar. Rachel hesitated for a moment before making her way toward it, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was small and bare, with a single window looking out over the fields. But what caught Rachel's attention was the figure hanging from the ceiling in the center of the room. Another scarecrow. Only this time, Rachel could see the truth. It wasn't a scarecrow. It was human, or at least, it had been. The body hung limply from the ceiling, its skin stretched tight over its bones, its eyes hollow and empty. The mouth was open in a silent scream, and the body swayed gently, though there was no breeze. Rachel's stomach churned as she backed away, her hands shaking. The scarecrow's body had been stitched together with wire, just like the harvesters outside. This had been one of their victims, and now they wanted her. Part 3. The Harvester's Embrace. Rachel's breath came in short gasps as she backed out of the room, her mind reeling with the horror of what she had seen. The scarecrow. It had once been a person, just like her, stitched together, strung up, and left to hang like a lifeless doll. A noise downstairs snapped her out of her thoughts. A low creaking, followed by the soft, unmistakable rustling of corn. The harvesters were inside the farmhouse. Her pulse quickened, and she looked around frantically for a way out. The window. It was her only option. She rushed toward it, yanking it open and peering down. The drop wasn't far, maybe 10 feet. She could make it if she jumped, but as she prepared to climb out, she froze. The cornfields below were moving. Rows upon rows of tall stalks rustled and swayed, and within them, she could see more figures emerging. Dozens of harvesters, their bodies long and spindly, their hollow eyes fixed on the farmhouse. There was no escape that way. Rachel slammed the window shut, her hands trembling. She was trapped. She had to find another way out, another hiding place. The creaking downstairs grew louder, the sound of heavy footsteps echoing through the house. The harvesters were searching for her, moving methodically from room to room. They weren't in any hurry. They knew she had nowhere to run. She needed to stay hidden, at least until she could figure out a plan. Rachel crept back down the hallway, her eyes darting from door to door. Most of the rooms were empty, just dusty, forgotten spaces filled with broken furniture and peeling wallpaper. But then she found one door that was locked. Her heart leaped. If she could get inside, maybe she could barricade herself until morning, or until she could find another way out. She jiggled the handle, but it wouldn't budge. She pushed against it with her shoulder, but the wood didn't give. In desperation, she kicked it, hoping to break the lock. The sound echoed through the house like a gunshot. Immediately, the rustling downstairs stopped. Rachel's heart sank. They had heard her. The soft creaking resumed, but now it was faster, more urgent. The harvesters were coming up the stairs. She panicked, kicking at the door again with all her strength. The wood splintered, and the door finally swung open. Rachel rushed inside, slamming it shut behind her, and fumbling for something to block it. The room was a small storage closet, filled with old boxes and cobwebs. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. She shoved a heavy wooden crate in front of the door, her hands shaking as she pushed it into place. Outside, the sound of footsteps drew closer, slow, deliberate. The harvesters were at the top of the stairs now, just outside the door. Rachel pressed her back against the wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She could hear them moving down the hallway, their bony fingers scraping against the walls, their hollow eyes searching for her. They stopped outside the door. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as she pressed herself against the wall, trying to make herself as small and invisible as possible. She held her breath, her entire body trembling with fear. For a long, agonizing moment, there was nothing but silence. And then, the doorknob rattled. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as the doorknob twisted, slowly, deliberately. The crate she had placed in front of the door shifted slightly, but the door didn't open. The harvesters were testing it, trying to get inside. The rattling grew louder, more insistent. Rachel bit her lip, her hands clenching into fists as she willed herself to stay quiet. If they got in, it was over. Suddenly the rattling stopped. For a moment Rachel thought they had given up, but then she heard it. The sound of burlap scraping against wood, the soft rustling growing louder. They were still there, just outside, waiting. Her body tensed as she heard a low creaking noise. It took her a moment to realize what it was. The harvesters were crawling over the walls. Rachel's blood ran cold. They were trying to find another way in. She could hear their movements now, slow, deliberate scraping as they climbed over the ceiling, their fingers digging into the wood. She looked up, her heart pounding in her chest. The ceiling was low, and she could hear them just inches above her. They were coming in through the roof. Rachel's mind raced. She had to get out. She couldn't stay here. But the only way out was the door, and the harvesters were already there. Desperation surged through her, and she pushed the crate away from the door, yanking it open. She bolted down the hallway, her footsteps echoing through the farmhouse as she ran. The rustling behind her grew louder, closer. The harvesters were chasing her now, their long limbs moving with unnatural speed as they crawled across the walls and ceiling, their hollow eyes fixed on her. Rachel sprinted down the stairs, her legs burning with exhaustion, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't stop. She couldn't stop. She reached the front door and threw it open, bursting out onto the porch. The cornfields loomed in front of her, but she didn't have a choice. She had to run. She bolted across the yard, her feet pounding against the dirt as she headed for the open road. The harvesters were right behind her, their long arms reaching out for her, their bony fingers scraping against the ground. Rachel's legs burned with effort, but she didn't slow down. She could see her car in the distance now, just a few more feet. Suddenly, she felt something wrap around her ankle, yanking her off her feet. She hit the ground hard. The air knocked from her lungs as she scrambled to get up. The harvesters were on her. Part 4. The Corn's Curse. Rachel's scream tore through the air as she kicked and struggled against the long, bony fingers that had wrapped around her leg. The ground was cold and hard beneath her as she scrambled to get up, her heart racing with panic. But the harvesters were too strong. Their fingers dug into her skin like iron claws, pulling her back toward the cornfields. "No!" she screamed, her voice hoarse with desperation. She thrashed against them, her hands clawing at the dirt as she tried to pull herself free. But the harvesters weren't human. Their strength was unnatural, and their burlap-covered limbs moved with terrifying precision. Rachel could feel the cold, rough fabric of their skin against her own, their wire stitches glinting in the moonlight as they tightened their grip on her. She kicked out again, this time managing to land a blow on one of the harvesters. Its head snapped to the side, but it didn't react. It didn't even flinch. Panic surged through her, and she reached for her camera, her only weapon. She swung it wildly at the creatures, the metal body of the camera slamming into one of their faces with a sickening thud. The harvester paused, its hollow eyes staring down at her, but it didn't release her. Instead, it tilted its head, as if studying her. Rachel's chest heaved with terror. She swung the camera again, harder this time, and the creature's head jerked back. This time, it let go. Rachel didn't wait. She scrambled to her feet, her muscles screaming with exhaustion as she bolted toward the car. But the harvesters were faster. She could hear them behind her, their long arms scraping against the ground, their hollow eyes fixed on her. The cornfields rustled and swayed as more of them emerged, their burlap bodies moving with unnatural grace. Rachel's legs burned as she ran, her vision blurring with fear and exhaustion. She was so close. The car was just a few feet away. If she could reach it, she could escape. She could get away from this nightmare. But then, something caught her ankle again, yanking her off her feet. She hit the ground hard, her head slamming into the dirt. Pain exploded behind her eyes, and for a moment, the world went black. When she came to, the harvesters were standing over her. Rachel's breath hitched in her throat as she stared up at them, her body frozen with terror. They loomed over her, their long arms hanging by their sides, their hollow eyes staring down at her. The largest of the harvesters stepped forward, its burlap skin stitched together with thick wire. Its face was a blank mask, its mouth a dark, twisted slit. Slowly it raised one long arm, pointing at her. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest. She tried to move, but her body wouldn't respond. She was trapped, paralyzed by fear. The harvester tilted its head, as if considering her for a moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it reached down and touched her chest with one long, bony finger. A cold shock ran through her body, and Rachel gasped as she felt her strength begin to drain away. Her limbs grew heavy, her vision blurred. The harvesters weren't just here to kill her. They were here to harvest her. Rachel's breath came in short, panicked bursts as the cold spread through her body. She could feel her energy slipping away, her life force being drawn into the creature's cold, hollow form. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The world began to fade, the edges of her vision darkening as the harvesters closed in around her. She could feel their cold, bony fingers on her skin, pulling at her, draining her life away. And then, just as the darkness threatened to swallow her whole, something inside her snapped. With a burst of desperate strength, Rachel shoved the harvester's hand away, rolling to the side. Her body screamed in protest, but she forced herself to move, to fight. She grabbed her camera again, swinging it wildly at the creatures. The metal slammed into their bodies with a satisfying crack, and the harvesters recoiled, their burlap skin tearing under the force of the blow. Rachel scrambled to her feet, her vision swimming as she stumbled toward the car. She could feel the cold fingers of the harvesters reaching for her, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. She reached the car and yanked the door open, throwing herself inside. Her hands shook as she fumbled for the keys, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The harvesters were closing in, their long arms reaching for the car, their hollow eyes staring at her through the windows. Rachel jammed the key into the ignition and turned it. The engine sputtered to life. Without hesitation, she slammed her foot on the gas, the tires screeching as the car lurched forward. The harvesters fell back, their bodies swaying as the car sped away from the farmhouse. Rachel's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. Her body ached, her vision blurred, but she kept driving. She didn't stop until the farmhouse was far behind her, swallowed by the endless rows of corn. Part 5. The Final Harvest. Rachel didn't slow down until she reached the outskirts of the nearest town, her hands still trembling on the steering wheel. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her mind raced with the horror of what had happened. The harvesters, the scarecrows, the cornfields, it all felt like a nightmare, but the pain in her body told her it was real. She pulled into a gas station and parked, her body slumping against the seat. For a long moment she just sat there, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she tried to calm herself. She was safe now. She had escaped. But as Rachel glanced into the rearview mirror, a chill ran down her spine. In the distance, barely visible through the rows of corn, she saw them. The harvesters. Their tall, thin forms stood at the edge of the fields, their hollow eyes fixed on her. They didn't move, didn't follow her. They didn't need to. Rachel knew deep down that she hadn't truly escaped. The harvesters had marked her. She was theirs now. a part of the harvest. And no matter where she went, no matter how far she ran, they would find her. She could never escape the corn's curse. The end.